About two-thirds of the way through the premiere episode of the new Dune Prophecy series from HBO, I found myself on the verge of checking out. While I read more sci-fi than any other genre, and enjoyed the main Dune series when I read it as a young man, I never got to the point of being completely obsessed with it, and never situated myself in the category of fan that if you dropped a reveal that a character's last name is Atreides, that I would instantly be all in on a project. As a TV guy, I was even a little disappointed when the new movies were announced, because as far as I can tell, the density of the lore and world building are the biggest selling points. Why try to cram all that into a feature's runtime when you could spend 10 to 12 episodes over multiple seasons really getting into it? Of course, the movies turned out to be a great success, so no complaints there. And even though I'd never read any of the newer Dune books, the ones that are written by Frank Herbert's son Brian and his writing partner Kevin J. Anderson, I was pretty excited to spend more time in the universe. So when I say I was about to check out, that's coming from my perspective as a TV recapper, not as some zealot of Dune lore. I honestly don't have a deep enough relationship with that to have strong feelings either way. Also, it's not really possible to not compare this to the recent movies, but it's not exactly fair. Those are bona fide blockbusters coming from an established filmmaker who appears to have the full backing of the studio to realize his vision. It's yet to be seen what Prophecy will develop into, but it's visibly not that. As far as new TV shows go, hearing that there were only 6 episodes was already a concern. What makes TV work is the extended amount of time we get to spend in a world getting to know its characters. Limiting that doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you're only thinking about budget. So while I was watching the introduction, this seemed to be working against the storytelling. There's a lot of information about this particular point in time in the Dune universe, a long list of characters to keep track of, plus the politics and motivations of this newly formed sisterhood, and the show feels like it's just flying right through it all. A premiere does have to set the table, and therefore you can forgive some exposition dumping, but it all felt like it was falling a little flat. By the time we got to the scene where young Lord Pruitt showed up in his short pants and got caught for carrying around some forbidden tech, I was sitting there thinking if this episode doesn't end with a strong hook, this show just might not be for me. Cue Travis Fimmel's character sauntering his way over to Short Pants for a little one-on-one time, where he can explain that it's precisely because the machine wars ended ages ago that it's so troubling that they're being controlled again, followed up with everything else that happens in that scene, and boom, now I can't wait to see what happens next. What is going on in this show then? It's interesting that it was originally branded as the origin story of the Bene Gesserit. It was going to be called Sisterhood of Dune or something along those lines, but in the development process it became Dune Prophecy, which is something to keep in mind. I'm not sure exactly, but I imagine the percentage of people using this as their initial entry point to this epic story Frank Herbert started writing in the 1960s is low. I also think the show is designed to stand on its own, and hope that it will fill in a lot of the important details in the next few episodes. So for now, I'll avoid regurgitating the fundamentals of the larger story. For what it's worth, the official logline for the show reads, "From the expansive universe of Dune, created by acclaimed author Frank Herbert, and 10,000 years before the ascension of Paul Atreides, Dune Prophecy follows 2 Harkonnen sisters as they combat forces that threaten the future of humankind and establish the fabled sect that will become known as the Bene Gesserit." Dune Prophecy is inspired by the novel Sisterhood of Dune, written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. In the opening sequence where we meet one of those 2 sisters, Valya Harkonnen, and she fills us in on the early days of the sisterhood, she opens with the question, what holds more truth, history or prophecy? Her family name is a familiar one. Even though they've been banished to a desolate world at the beginning of this series, by the time of Paul Atreides, we know that they've amassed enough wealth to reestablish themselves as a great house of the Landsraad, and are in control of the spice mining operations on Arrakis. This gets to the history part of her question. From the context the show gives us, House Harkonnen has a chip on its shoulder. She says the history that House Atreides wrote is full of lies, and she set out to change that. The crux of this is related to the Butlerian Jihad, which the show references saying when humans rose up against the thinking machines that had enslaved them, history says it was an Atreides who led them to victory, while my great-grandfather deserted the fight. It doesn't elaborate any further, and I mentioned that when I heard about this show I hadn't read any of the Brian Herbert, Kevin J. Anderson books, so I had ideas about the Jihad based on the original series, and vaguely knew that there was some pushback from fans and how they chose to explain that in the prequels. In preparation for covering the show, I delved into the Great Schools of Dune trilogy. That gave me a workable understanding of how the show will likely handle this period of history. And without derailing too much, the quote from Frank Herbert you usually see referenced from Dune is, "Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them." Where in its opening moments, the show refers to the thinking machines as the enslavers. If this really is your first introduction to Dune, the important part is that this is why things are as they are. This is a far future story, but it's still humanity's story that originated on Earth. And if you think about it in terms of our calendar, you're looking at about the year 13,000. The Jihad and the Butlerian movement that existed long after the fighting ended crusaded against thinking machines, but this extended to most of the technology that was in use. This was a huge change, and you can imagine how that would affect the quality of life of just about everyone. In the absence of computers, humans still needed to perform calculations. I mean, they fly around in spaceships and things like that, and that led to the creation of the Order of Mentats. If you've only ever seen the movies, this is something they don't spend a lot of time exploring. There is one scene where you see House Atreides' Mentat sort of roll his eyes back in his head as he calculates how much it would cost for the Emperor's delegation to travel to Caladan. At this same time, the Sisterhood that Valya tells us in the beginning of the first episode she chose as her new family was organized by the first Mother Superior Raquella. There's a lot of information the show leaves out here, which I have to imagine they're saving for other episodes rather than completely glossing over. That's something I'll come back to, but in the decades following the war, this sisterhood led by Raquella, who trained sisters to become truthsayers and assigned them to great houses to form a network of influence throughout the Imperium, which was in the early years of its existence, and according to Valya, they would govern the future this way. The inherent problem was that those who held power were driven by violence and greed, and the Sisterhood decided they needed more than just guidance. They required transformation, and that's where the secret breeding program came into play. They put together a genetic archive intending to foster the right royal unions and produce rulers they could control. There was a split in her followers, with a faction of zealots led by Dorothea that saw the breeding program as heresy. And because Raquella knew Valya shared her vision, she called for her on her deathbed. Everything I've touched on so far is mentioned in the first 3.5 minutes, which I suppose makes sense because this is more or less what they're still trying to do 10,000 years later. From there we travel to the homeworld of the Sisterhood, Wallach IX, and get the first real scene of the series. Raquella is on her deathbed and Dorothea is at her side. She's surrounded by the zealots, and when Valya arrives, the Mother Superior tells her she's seen Tiran Arafel, which is a reckoning, a holy judgment brought on by a tyrant, and we get glimpses of her vision that includes a sandworm that consumes what looks like a temple. She urges her to grow the Sisterhood and use every tool at her disposal to safeguard their power. She also says that Valya will be the one to see the burning truth and know as she breathes her last breath. It's a little vague, but when she speaks with the other sisters, Valya believes they need to put one of their own on the throne, someone who was loyal to them to become the first empress of the Imperium. Dorothea believes they're meant to guide the Imperium rather than rule it, and tries to destroy the genetic archive as soon as she gets the chance because she sees it as them playing God. When Valya isn't able to convince her to follow her plan, she reveals her ability to use the voice and uses it to make her take her own life. It's effective in getting rid of the opposition, and she ends the flashback by saying that she knew her name would forever be damned to the wrong side of history, but her truth lay in prophecy. From there, we jump forward 30 years and see that the Sisterhood seems to be growing and spreading its influence under Valya's direction, just as Raquella wanted. The school is filled with recruits, and they're getting requests from different houses for truthsayers. One of the requests comes from her own house, Harkonnen, which she denies for the fourth time, showing that the past continues to influence the present. Their plan now is to marry the daughter of the Emperor, who is about to become a member of the Sisterhood, to a 9-year-old boy from House Richese. Princess Inez seems completely on board with this arrangement because she can do whatever she wants until he comes of age, and believes that her time learning with the Sisterhood will make her a better leader. Oh, and I mentioned that in Raquella's vision, the structure the sandworm destroyed looked like a temple. When we visit Wallach IX, we see that it's actually just their school transplanted on Arrakis. In a story like this, where everyone is concerned with grabbing and holding on to power, motivation is where things usually get interesting. Even in Valya's case, where we know some of the story, that her grandfather was labeled a coward and her family lost its status. In the book series, this is explained. The thinking machines used ships full of people as human shields, and her grandfather refused the order to advance, knowing that they'd all be killed. So he had good reason. Even in that case, we have to imagine there are more layers to discover in the coming weeks. Since the first episode needs to introduce so many different characters and locations, it doesn't have enough time to dig deep into any of them. But to its credit, the show seems to be aware of this. We bounce around the Sisterhood school, getting bits and pieces of their training as learn to first exert power over themselves so that they can serve the great houses as truthsayers to shape the flow of power. There are details to pick up about each of the sisters, but it's hard to ascertain which ones we're supposed to be paying attention to. To clear this up, we get a conversation between the two Harkonnen sisters alone in a room, where they run down a list of potential sisters to pair the princess up with when she arrives for training. It's essentially saying these are the important bits you need to remember. Jen is the confident one, who stands out as being somewhat ahead of her sisters in the sequence where they interview the liars. And Valya says she'll go far if she can be tamed. There's a sense that she might be too much of a free thinker for this task, and Tula thinks she might be too much like Valya herself. So they discuss each of their favorites. Valya favors Theodosia, and Tula says she has reason to be loyal since they took her in when she had nowhere else to go. Tula appears to have a deep connection with Lila, who she says is a true empath, while Valya says she's like a lost lamb in the woods. There's something important about her lineage that they don't go into, and Tula is convinced that she'll toughen up as she gets older. If nothing else, the camera seems to linger on these three a little longer than the others, and this exchange gives us a better idea of how the Harkonnen sisters' views about their purpose differ. Their conversation gets interrupted when a ship carrying Kasha from Solusa Secundus arrives. She's the truthsayer assigned to the Emperor, and the one that provides us with insight into what they do other than functioning as human lie detectors. The Emperor has a sit-down with the Patriarch of House Richese ahead of the wedding that will tie their families together. Both men have their truthsayer behind them who communicate with each other through sign language, and at least in the case of this particular Emperor Javico, he seems to take Kasha's counsel about everything. This may be more of a statement about who he is rather than how the sisters function generally, because while he seems to be fit for the role, you get the sense that all these external forces trying to sway his influence is something he could do without. He appears to get a bit of this from his wife at home as well, but otherwise there's not much that feels out of place within his family. The Richeses are gifting him a fleet of ships to sweeten the deal and want to secure a better foothold at the palace in return. His truthsayer silently explains to Kasha that he's doing this because he wants control of Arrakis, and if he's at the palace, it'll be easier for him to sway the great houses. The show mostly refers to the situation in Arrakis anecdotally, but I guess all we need to know right now is that even at this particular period in history, the planet and its spice are important. Richese claims his ships will solve the Emperor's problems on Dune, and he brings up the incident that Desmond Hart was the only survivor from that we'll hear about later. It's probably worth mentioning here that this planet, which serves as the seat of power for the Imperium and is the homeworld of House Corrino, looks a lot different when it's first introduced in the 2021 movie. By that point, it's become a prison world known for its harsh environment and where we're first introduced to the Sardaukar troops. It's interesting to think that some of what the Corrinos were doing there, just being humans and using up the natural resources, led to it becoming that dark, harsh place thousands of years later. And speaking of changes, 27 minutes in, there's a tracking shot of a mysterious character as he approaches the royal palace. From the fact that it's an actor I'm familiar with as someone who covered Raised by Wolves, and to be honest, it looks a little like he showed up in character as Marcus from that show and they were just like, all right, no need to change anything. From how it's shot and how he holds a piece of fabric or something similar in his hand, and that seeming to be important, it's at this moment that the episode started to come to life for me. We'll find out that Desmond Hart is a decorated soldier who did 12 tours on Arrakis, and even though the Emperor had been told his entire regiment was wiped out in a Fremen attack, he's there because he's the only one who can tell Habako the truth about what happened. He explains that the attack wasn't carried out by Fremen, but by insurgents from his own allied worlds. Once their harvester ejected its payload of spice, their ship collected it, so it was essentially theft. Kasha does her thing and tells the Emperor that his story is true, or at least he believes it to be. He requests a post at the palace, and it's obvious something is going on with this guy. And his lingering stare at Kasha as he walks out of the room backs that up. She has a vision that includes some of the visuals from the one Raquella had on her deathbed, like Princess Inez's red dress and some shades of sandworm, but she also sees the fruit the future royal couple will share at the wedding announcement party filled with maggots, and an image of Valya sitting on the throne. Then Inez shouts at her, "You did this," as sand falls, and I don't know, she's in the sandworm's mouth. And then it ends with the same creepy robotic looking eyes that Raquella saw. Unsurprisingly, this all freaks her out, and Kasha goes to the princess's bedroom to say goodbye before she leaves for Wallach IX. She downplays her concerns to Inez, focusing instead on when they first met, but tells Valya and Tula that it wasn't a normal nightmare. The fear she felt and is still feeling is real, which I'm going to go out on a limb here and wonder aloud if this doesn't have something to do with Desmond's arrival. Because as she talks about how she knows the princess better than anyone, she also reveals that they're the ones who are behind weakening the Emperor's position on Arrakis. Valya comes off as inflexible in the exchange and doesn't want to entertain the idea that they might be accelerating the reckoning rather than preventing it. She tells Kasha to spend the night to remind herself of her purpose because they're going to make this marriage happen no matter what. She also pushes back against Tula when she urges her to check the match later. She does do that though, saying that after checking the genetic archive, their plan holds. This is the match that stabilizes the Corrino line for centuries. The announcement party is what you'd expect. It's funny to watch Pruitt's face as he stands there in his shorts while his father is droning on about his seed finding purchase in royal wombs. Inez makes her entrance in the red dress, which feels ominous against the backdrop of the visions. Beyond the awkwardness of a kid getting ready to get married, the thing that seems most important here is his little machine and the reaction when it's discovered. It's described as a toy and doesn't appear to be anything more nefarious, but you can't help but think of the hunter-seeker drone that was used for the assassination attempt against Paul. Nez and her brother have one last night out with some space drugs and sex with her swordmaster, who you could tell she was definitely into in earlier scenes, and in this one, it's revealed that his last name is Atreides. While they're doing that, Desmond tries to work his way into the Emperor's head. While he thinks a fleet of fighters will solve his problems on Arrakis, he tells them that they'll do nothing about the growing insurgency in the Imperium. According to him, more and more people wonder if they were too quick to discard the machines, and why only the great houses profit from spice. He makes the point that he's surprised Kasha hasn't told him about this, since the witches are supposed to know everything. It is a way in. The Emperor admits she's never steered him wrong, but he's never felt good about the marriage. It comes on the heels of Kasha telling him the attack on Arrakis was an isolated incident, while someone who was there is now sitting in front of him saying that it goes much deeper. Of course, it makes sense that she would try to downplay it since the Sisterhood is pulling the strings and needs Havoko to need the ships from House Richese. So you could see how Desmond could loosen their grip. Then he swerves into what sounds like religious fervor, asking if he believes in forces that extend beyond man and machine. I guess this is as good a place as any to mention how the actor is constantly doing some interesting things with his character's eyes that keep him one step away from looking completely insane. Havoko says religion is his wife's refuge, and doesn't look completely thrilled that the conversation has steered toward the gods. Desmond knows he shouldn't be there. The attack should have killed him. And when he fought his way out of the sand and took his first breath, he felt reborn and unafraid. The situation as orchestrated doesn't give Havoko a different option besides the marriage. If he loses Arrakis and the spice, he'll lose the backing of the great houses. If the gods were to intervene, though, that would be a different story, and this cranks up Desmond's crazy eyes even more. Sandwiched in between this conversation, the clubbing, and the whopper of an ending is a quiet scene between Jen and Lila in the dormitory. Noticing that the younger girl can't sleep, Jen asks if it's bad dreams. After Lila mentions that she was raised by the Sisterhood and the Reverend Mothers don't know who their parents are, or even if they do know, they don't tell the children, Jen tells her not to worry. One way or another, our past always finds us. This is followed by a shot of Valya looking at the wall hanging depicting Reverend Mother Raquella, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier about more of her past being revealed in the future episodes. But it also makes you wonder about the mention of Lila's lineage earlier and what that sets up for her moving forward in the story. Bad dreams, you say? First, Havoko wakes up from one and wanders out of his room to find a recording that was mysteriously left for him. He starts to watch what turns out to be Desmond being devoured by a sandworm on Arrakis. At the same time, due to nightmares, little Pruitt can't sleep, and when he leaves his room, he runs into Mr. Wormfood. If it hadn't been completely obvious yet, as he talks to the boy, it becomes clear that he's got a real issue with the Sisterhood. He sees the current situation as a war hidden in plain sight. Because of the incident with his toy, and how Desmond's description of the Bene Gesserit control sounds very similar to the problem with the thinking machines, Pruitt initially thinks that's what he's talking about. He clarifies that it's also troubling because they won that war, and now they're being controlled again. He explains he's been given great power, and that winning a war requires sacrifice. He assures Pruitt that his won't be in vain, and then watches as the boy starts burning all over before slumping to the floor dead. And with him, the plans the Sisterhood has been manipulating into place have been undone. He's sort of touching his forehead while this all goes down, which gives it a supernatural feel. Plus, with everyone having dreams to help move things into place, it certainly feels possible that he has some sort of powers. At the same time, on Wallach IX, the sisters are disturbed in their rooms by screaming and find Kasha in the halls who's experiencing the same thing. Valya gets there to watch her burn with her own crazy-looking eyes, interpreting this as the burning that Mother Raquella told her she'd see. It's almost as if she's looking right past the horror that's playing out in front of her, blinded by her role in relation to the prophecy. This ending really brought me around and got me incredibly excited to see where things go next. Again, that's coming from my perspective as a TV recapper. I mean, there are some things here that could connect back to the original series in interesting ways, and I'd be all for it if that happens, but I'd also be fine if they just take this opportunity to craft a compelling story that's just its own thing. I said it isn't fair to compare it to the movies, but at the same time, that's how IP works. It's unavoidable. Some of the people watching are watching it because it's related to that. So the first half felt small in comparison, and while watching the Sisterhood manipulating things behind the scenes is very Dune and could be compelling on its own, the introduction of whatever's going on at the end here gave it some size and the right kind of weirdness. I think they're doing some interesting stuff with Valya and Desmond being very similar in their aims while being on opposite sides. I do think motivation is where things will get interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing additional layers related to what compels them. Way back in the flashbacks, there were some shots where Tula's reactions to things Valya tells her seem like there might be something else going on. In the scene where she mentions they need to put a sister on the throne in particular. And I'll be interested to see if something develops between them at home while Desmond is coming for the Sisterhood. As far as what's going on with him, my initial thoughts as a non-lore diehard were related to a couple of different things that are introduced in Dune Messiah. I'm actually kind of happy not knowing, and we'll leave that up to the people who know more about the deeper cuts than I do. As far as whether or not it's supernatural, the other instance of something that could appear to be magic is Valya using the voice to end Dorothea. The way that's described in the original books is not magic at all. It's something that can be honed by training and has more to do with controlling the tone of your voice. The same goes for the mentats I mentioned earlier. While what they do is essentially superhuman, it's also achieved through training, which makes me think that whatever Desmond is doing, while he might not have been able to train himself to make a kid catch on fire, there's probably a more straightforward explanation. But since religion and fanaticism play a big role in these stories, it'll be interesting to see how he's experiencing these great powers. I'm curious to find out, and I think that is a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.